to those of you who've stayed, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. 30 years ago, 30 years and 6 months ago, I flew to Abu Dhabi as a newly qualified chartered accountant, completely disillusioned with audit, which I hated. That was a very good question. I'm interested to know who the Big Four auditor was. I signed a waiver and a release. I signed an NDA, which I think has expired, although I haven't checked. And I was put into an unmarked building next to the original ADIA head office. And we had armed guards on the door and bars on the windows. I was never really sure if that was to keep us in or to keep creditors out. And there I was, working on my first insolvency engagement in the Middle East. Today, here we are with a dedicated stream to turn around restructuring and insolvency at Abu Dhabi Finance Week. And I think just that says an awful lot about how far we've come. I think the biggest shift and the biggest change is cultural and psychological. 30 years ago, you couldn't mention the words. They were completely haram. Bankruptcy wasn't talked about. Insolvency was something that people didn't do. Now we have an environment where I think we have regulators, be it ADGM, DIFC, the Saudi government, sponsored by the Ministry of Commerce. We have dedicated professionals in the Big Four. We have boutique firms, smaller firms, medium-sized firms. We have law firms who have dedicated restructuring professionals here. Even the banks have moved forward, and rather than just dealing with a credit team, you're dealing with workout professionals as well. I think the fact that all of that is here has created an environment where now it's okay to discuss it and it's okay to deal with those issues. We've seen rafts of new legislation across the region, in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, in the UAE. As I say, we have dedicated professionals, the law firms, the accounting firms. We have not just new legislation, but we have governments who are prepared to invest in educating judges, training judges, educating and training bankruptcy professionals who are prepared to take appointments as bankruptcy trustees. And I think a point that came up earlier, we've seen the secondary market players move in, and I can promise you from our situation where probably our debt was about $9-10 billion, over a third of that debt traded, and had it not been for the secondary market, I'm not sure we would have achieved the success that we did. I'm sure that most of you have heard of Al Ghassabi and the Saad Group. Total liabilities, claims across the world, probably in excess of $40 billion, which I think makes it one of the largest defaults that occurred at the end of the global financial crisis. I'm not going to get into the aspects of fraud that we allege, because that's still a contentious point. But I think if you go back to 2009, you had entities in Bahrain, second and fourth largest banks, you had businesses in Saudi Arabia, and you had a global web of companies across the world built by the Saad Group. In Saudi Arabia in 2009, there was no enforcement law. There was no bankruptcy law. There was alternative dispute resolution, no arbitration law. And there was a newly introduced SAMA Banking Disputes Committee. So at the time, it probably looked impossible to resolve even a normal bankruptcy, let alone such a complex and diverse situation that we had. Saudi Arabia ultimately introduced a bankruptcy law in late 2018. We worked with the Ministry of Commerce, and they were very open to dialogue, and I think that is one of the key factors in any successful bankruptcy, is you have to have a dialogue. The parties have to talk, they have to work together. You're not always going to agree. In fact, probably you never will. But if you don't have a dialogue and communicate, it's not going to work. Even when they introduced that new law, I still wasn't convinced that we were going to succeed, because I was pretty skeptical as to whether a Sharia-based legal system would enforce cram-down against dissenting creditors, particularly if those dissenting creditors were large Saudi national banks. I'm happy as we stand here today, it did work, and they did. As I say, the key factors, clearly the law. Without that law, we wouldn't have succeeded. But not just the law, but the will and the motivation of the regulators. And I think we see that across the region. I worked between that first event in 1992 and now for 30 years. I've worked across the world in South America, Argentina, Panama, North America, Europe, Asia, on insolvency type restructuring arrangements. And I think what we've achieved here, I would match up against those jurisdictions any day of the week. And not just that, but at significantly less cost. I mean, people will talk about how much money's been spent on the Al Ghasabi and Saad cases. Most of that was spent pre-bankruptcy law, and it was us trying to maintain ourselves in a position where we would ultimately be able to take advantage of that. As I say, clearly the biggest factor was the bankruptcy law. The secondary market was hugely important. I think we've seen more recently with the ADCB sale of their NPL, the banks here are more willing to engage in a conversation. Doesn't mean they'll agree, but at least there's a conversation. And I think that's really important. And we filed in late 18, we were rejected again, ultimately admitted into a bankruptcy process in May 19. We pretty much lost a year due to COVID. Were accepted by creditor vote. 95% of the creditors voted in favor of our plan on the 7th of September 21. Court ratified that late September 21. And at this point, we've returned over $1.25 billion to creditors, which I think is just over 17 cents on the dollar, which, of course, creditors want more. I always tell people, how do I know I've done a good job, assuming that I have? It's because everybody hates me. The creditors want more, the family think they should have paid less. Therefore, job well done. And as I said before, I would put that up against any job I've done anywhere else in the world, particularly one that was this complex. The allegations of fraud, the web of companies across the world, the sort of intra and extra jurisdictional factors made this particularly complicated. And I think it says a lot about the will and motivation of the governments in this region, that they've recognized the need to have a viable, working, world-leading bankruptcy regime, because it's like insurance, right? We all buy car insurance. We don't want to crash our car, but it can happen. And if you want to attract inward investment, if you want to be able to hold yourself out on the world stage as a leading financial jurisdiction, you have to be able to clean up the mess if it happens. Also, there are viable businesses that get into difficulty, and being able to save those is really important. So, I think one of the things that I'm most proud about is that we still have over 6,000 employees at AHAB. And those people have multiple dependents in multiple countries. So being able to preserve that business, return money to creditors, was something that was really important to us. And I think as we enter what is clearly going to be a difficult period for the world, and hopefully the Gulf will be somewhat insulated, there is going to be more distress, and there's going to be more need for people to be able to work together, bringing in the professionals who are now based here, with the regulators, with the authorities, with the courts, the judges, the bankruptcy professionals, the important role of the secondary market. I think we're well placed here to cope with whatever difficulties may lay ahead. And hopefully next year we'll be able to stand here and talk about more success under these new regimes. So, as I say, thank you all for staying, for those of you who did. I'm happy to take some questions if people have any. I suspect there may be a couple.
Your role was very much easier after the bankruptcy law, or you were doing, let us say, very good, then you made perfect, or it's a big change? So it was before you were suffering, let us say, for 18 years or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite unique perhaps, and the reason I was a debtor-appointed CRO. I would say from 2013 through 2018, the best I could do was keep them alive, but I was never going to be able to reach a resolution. The only alternatives were endless value-destructive litigation or unanimous consent, and getting 150 creditors to unanimously agree to a deal was virtually impossible. So I think without the implementation of that bankruptcy law, they'd have been burying me in the desert.
Simon, there was, I don't know, big talk about that. You people, you were, let us say, privileging the Saudi banks rather than the overseas banks. I'm not sure how much that is true, but we were abroad, we were expecting that is happening. How much that it's true, and how much did that affect your, let us say, relation with the, especially banks out of Saudi Arabia?
You know, right from the outset, the family charged me with trying to find a resolution, and we tried in 2009, we tried in 2010. We were led to believe, I'll put it like that, in 2013, that doing a deal with the Saudi banks was the right thing for us to do. That made me very uncomfortable. I think you have to be fair, and if the system's not fair, you're not going to attract any FDI, that's for sure. I think very quickly after we'd been led to believe that, we saw the SAMA Banking Disputes Committee starting to issue judgments for foreign banks. Quickly after that, we had the new enforcement law introduced, and banks were treated equally by that tribunal, which was comforting. So at that point, we turned around to the Saudi banks and said, whatever it was you were led to believe, we can't do that. And as I say, even when the law came in, I was still skeptical. Would they actually cram down a dissenting Saudi creditor? And they did. Touch wood, we're not finished, but that there does seem to have been the political will to do that.
One last question from me, if you allow me. I recall that when we lodged our claim with the Khobar court, I think they were not recognizing the conventional loan. Also, only they were recognizing the Sharia compliance loans. How much now the difference is there between Sharia and conventional? And did they recognize later on, or they say that?
No, I mean, I think one of the things under the bankruptcy law is you don't need a final judgment. The bankruptcy trustee will review the claims, and he can recommend to the judge whether they be accepted. We had Saudi claims, Saudi judgments, GCC judgments under treaty. We had UK, even a New York judgment, and we even did, I think we did 23 arbitrations in under 12 months, and all of those claims were admitted. So I think that was one of the more surprising elements, that it wasn't a very strict, you have to be a Saudi judgment in a Sharia court. They considered all claims. And I guess one of the other interesting factors was, even after that, when creditors thought, okay, I can't do anything in Saudi, I'm going to try and do something in the UAE. The sort of reciprocity and comity between the courts in the GCC, recognizing the laws was really powerful to me.
Thanks, Simon, and thank you for all
Blinded
the
by-
work that you've done over the years. And as creditors, we obviously appreciate it. But you made an interesting comment about the secondary participants' role in the restructuring and reaching a conclusion. And I thought it would be something interesting, perhaps, to expand upon. I mean, how would you think that the entrance of the secondary participants changed the dynamics, and how did it lead to a resolution that we finally able to reach?
You know, I think, and I'm not going to pick on any specific group, but I think everybody's moved forward. So today we have better conversations with regional banks than we had 10 years ago. But 10 years ago, most of the GCC banks, they wouldn't talk to you. You couldn't have a conversation. So getting the secondary players in, getting it away from the credit side of the bank to workout people, to people who understood. I would say it was, after the introduction of the law and the political will, it was the most important factor in our ability to succeed. And I think over a third of our debt has now traded. And you know, the secondary market is motivated differently, right? They're also, at least traditionally, more expertise and experience in workouts. So I think it was critical. So very happy to see that you're opening an office. Well, I hope you all stay and enjoy Abu Dhabi. Those of you who live here, thank you. And for the foreigners who've come in, stay and enjoy the hospitality and enjoy the Formula One. And hopefully Mercedes will win again. Thank you very much.